Okay, Anna Lemke, I have the book here, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And will say how much I enjoyed the book, because an indicator of how much I enjoy books is how much the pages have been folded down. So that's all my notes, everything I want to speak about, things I want to remember. So let's just start with, what is dopamine and how would you describe its role in the brain?
Dopamine is a chemical that our brain makes. It's essential for movement. It's also essential for motivation, reward, and pleasure. It's also the key molecule involved in the process of getting addicted. Things that are addictive release more dopamine in the brain's reward pathway than things that are not. And the driver for addiction ultimately becomes not the pleasure that we get from the substance, but actually the physiologic drive to not be in pain. And that works through this process of sort of relativity, the theory of relativity when it comes to pleasure and pain, and how they're like opposite sides of the balance.
Yeah. So do people get more pleasure out of the drive to do something, the anticipation to do something, than the actual experience itself? Or does the experience itself also produce dopamine?
The experience itself actually is the big payback, but we also get a little bit of dopamine when we're reminded of our drug of choice, either through external stimuli, a person, a place, a thing that reminds us of using the drug, or presages that the drug is soon to be available. But even our own euphoric recall of that drug can release a little bit of dopamine. But whether it's dopamine that's released in anticipation of the drug, or dopamine that's released when we actually get the drug, the key piece is that after dopamine levels increase in response to that, they quickly decrease, not to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels, into a dopamine deficit state. And that is what drives craving, and also the incredible amount of work that people are willing to put toward getting their drug of choice, even when they're no longer feeling good. So I think that's the sort of the message there, that dopamine is really essential to responding to changes in our external and internal environment. It's very sensitive to intoxicants and cues that are pleasurable, but it can also be triggered by novelty, things that are new, and even aversive stimuli that our brains want us to pay attention to because they're potentially life-threatening. So it's a very important molecule, again, for making these constant micro readjustments to the environment. And the essential, the thesis of the book is that because we're living in this world of never-ending overabundance of highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, in order to compensate for the constant bombardment of dopamine, we essentially have gone into this chronic dopamine deficit state, both individually and collectively, such that there's more anxiety, more depression, more bodily pain, because we have too much dopamine.
And I suppose one thing I found interesting was almost the irony of addiction, in that when people take their drug of choice and they go into that dopamine deficit state, that might make them stressed, anxious, mostly about the addiction. So they might get very stressed about the addiction. Then that'll make them take the drug again to soothe those feelings of stress and anxiety and start that cycle over again. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I mean, it's this terrible vicious cycle. We do something pleasurable, the balance tips this way, but then to try to bring it level again, we adapt to that, not just to level, but to the opposite. And we're feeling anxious, then we want more of the drug, and we can feel then shame and depression about wanting more, but it's also just the physiology of wanting the drug. So then we use more, and then we go back to that painful side. So it's this constant sort of teeter-totter that is elaborated upon by our own narrative, right? And the narrative is often a narrative of shame, self-loathing, lying about our use, which then leads to more shame, all of which that can drive reuse. But even separate from the stories that we tell about our use is this physiologic dopamine deficit state that follows on the heels of an increase in dopamine. And that alone can drive repeated reuse, even in the absence of real pleasure.
Mm-hmm. And how does dopamine contrast with molecules like serotonin? So like Daniel, one of the books I'm reading now, so after I read your book, I'm now very, very much interested in neuroscience and dopamine itself. So I'm reading The Molecule of More,
Right.
by Daniel Lieberman. And so he calls these molecules here and now molecules. So
Right.
how do they contrast with dopamine?
Well, dopamine is essentially the sort of final common pathway of all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. It's not the only molecule that is involved in that. Serotonin is involved. That's especially released when we feel connected to other people, also in response to various appetitive stimuli. Norepinephrine, our endogenous cannabinoid system, our endogenous opioid system. We make all of these molecules in our own brains and bodies. And if we are ingesting substances that release those molecules all of a sudden in the reward pathway, then our brain will respond to that by stopping to manufacture as much of that molecule on our own, which again is what gets us into this sort of deficit state. So dopamine is just one of many of such molecules, but it's probably again sort of the final common pathway. And certainly in the animal science, the kind of way that we measure how reinforcing, a drug or a behavior is.
So going specifically into the book itself, you start off with, I think it's a very good choice the way you start off the book, because you speak about one of your patients called Jacob, who is addicted to pornography and masturbation. And I think that is a very striking opening, and it drives me, it drove me into the book, because I just found that very interesting. I think a lot of people would maybe talk about pornography addiction and say that it's not possible to be addicted to something like that. How and why do people become addicted to stuff like that?
Well, I mean, it's clearly a drug and highly addictive for some individuals. And I think the number of people addicted to pornography is only growing. And I think this is really a hidden addiction. There's enormous shame with all types of addictions, but I think especially with pornography addiction, especially among men. When we have an orgasm, it floods our brain with all kinds of feel-good neurotransmitters, including dopamine. So the orgasm itself is potentially a drug. And then if you then pair that with a stimulus, a visual stimulus, usually, an image or, a moving image or a still image, which is also a drug, right? Because that goes right to the visual cortex, which then goes to our reward pathway. Then you have really a very potent drug, because you've got the visual stimulus, plus you've got the physiologic orgasm. It's super addictive. And when people get addicted to pornography, it follows a very similar trajectory as getting addicted to other drugs and behaviors. People usually start out for fun or to solve a problem. The problem is usually something like insomnia, boredom, anxiety, depression. If it works for them, then they go back to it. Over time, with repeated exposure, they need more and more of that drug or more potent forms to get the same effect. And then pretty soon they're using regularly, compulsively, in an out of control way, and in a way that has harmful consequences, maybe harmful for their job, maybe for their relationships, even physical harm. People can develop orgasm problems, problems with ejaculation, all kinds of physical problems. And then of course the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which is to say what we experience when we stop, are psychological symptoms, including anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. And people who stop pornography will immediately spiral into severe withdrawal. They will even have, vivid dreams that involve using, which is very common for people who stop drugs and alcohol as well. Relapse dreams, they wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if they had really used. So all of that is just very, very similar to people who get addicted to drugs and alcohol.
Does novelty play a part in this as well? I think, like maybe in the 70s when the internet wasn't here, the pornography of that time would have been magazines, one magazine at a time, whereas now the massive change in the the scale of internet pornography right now gives people that sort of novelty with one click.
That's right. So if I were to mention the four things in the modern ecosystem that make this such an addictogenic world, it would be access, easy access, increased quantity. So pornography online is literally infinite, right? It's unlike a line of cocaine that you would eventually run out and have to go out and buy more. That's not true for pornography or TikTok or video games. Potency is huge. So one of the ways to overcome tolerance is to make a drug more potent. One of the ways to make a drug more potent is to combine two drugs together. You see that all the time online with digital products, including pornography. Now you've got gamification or enumeration, or you've got a lot of people joining the same space at once. So you're experiencing the same emotion at the same time. So you're combining pornography, the drug, with that sort of, distorted human connection with other people. And then finally, novelty. You're absolutely right. Dopamine is very responsive to new stimuli in the environment. And what these AI algorithms do specifically is learn us and then suggest to us something similar to what we liked before, but just a little bit different. And that sort of treasure hunting mode is really deeply ingrained in us. We're always looking for sort of like the next new thing or the next best thing, which is what keeps a lot of us online long past that activity has become pleasurable. It's like we know we're not really enjoying anymore, but we just keep thinking, oh, well, something new is going to come along. I also think the key piece about novelty is that, there are lots of people for whom traditional drugs like alcohol, nicotine, cannabis are not particularly reinforcing. But now there's a whole panoply of new drugs online that didn't exist before that are potentially reinforcing. And that certainly happened to me, just in terms of what I talk about in the book, how I've really never found alcohol, caffeine, or other traditional drugs reinforcing. Like they just don't tip my pleasure pain balance to the side of a pleasure. They don't release much dopamine for me. But, online activities are highly reinforcing for me. As I talk about in the book, I got addicted to romance novels, mainly through my Kindle, when I could just get them one after another. I'm very easily, addicted to things on YouTube where I can find myself just hours later, looking for that next YouTube video. So I think this novelty piece also expands the net for people who will get addicted, meaning that there are many more of us now struggling with minor and chronic low-grade addictions.
Do you have any ideas on any solutions for this? Because I think a lot of people like to think with these things that there's one big simple solution, but in reality, there's a lot of different things that could be done. And one off the top of my head is just looking at the root of the issue here and looking at how old should we allow children to have mobile phones and have internet access, and what should we be doing should we be monitoring children's internet access? Should we be restricting children's internet access? What else could be done for this to reduce the amount of people who become addicted to things like pornography, social media? I think in the digital age, I think novelty is quite a big problem. And I think social media mimics that of pornography in that you're getting so much novelty from these things. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of their vulnerability to at least overconsumption, but at worst, addiction.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that it's exaggerated to conceptualize the phone as equivalent to a pack of cigarettes. And we wouldn't give a pack of cigarettes, to a minor, and we wouldn't advertise cigarettes to minors. We have all kinds of restrictions in place. Cigarettes are a legal drug, but we have individually, collectively, and also from a top-down level, restricted access and use. And I think that we need to do similar things with smartphones, especially when it comes to children. Remember that we are born with more neurons than we're ever going to have. And through the process of the developing brain between age 0 to 25 is essentially a slow process of pruning or cutting back the neurons that we're not using and myelinating or making more efficient the neurons that we use frequently as we develop those circuits that will become really the foundation for our adult brains. And this process especially happens, this pruning back process in early to late adolescence and continues to about age 25. So if we're learning maladaptive coping strategies, through that key neuronal development process, then we're establishing, a foundational brain structure that's not going to serve us well into adulthood. Of course, we do preserve plasticity throughout life, and the brain can continue to change and heal and all of that. But I just think it's super important that kids not have unrestricted access and unmonitored access to the internet until they're at least teenagers. And even then, that it be limited, that it be monitored, that there be active discussions about what's appropriate, safe use and what isn't, both in terms of consuming content and putting content out there. And I think this is something that we can't just leave up to parents to police. I think the schools need to step in and help us out and take phones away during class time and during the school day, create spaces where kids are learning to problem solve without necessarily using a computer to do that, learning to socialize without necessarily using a computer to do that. And then acknowledging that the vast majority of people will probably be able to self-correct and figure this out, but there will be, as with all intoxicants and drugs, a subset of individuals, about 10 to 15% in the population, who will get addicted, and that we have to make sure that we have additional resources, i.e. addiction treatment for those individuals, and that they will need a more extreme type of intervention in order to help them, because that's their drug of choice. One person's social media is another person's cocaine. And so I think we just really have to own that is true, and, do what we can.
I think the most telling thing is that the people that made these phones, or the people that made these social media sites, did not allow their children to use them. That's right. The most telling thing, because they know the power of what they've created.
That's right. I live here in the heart of Silicon Valley, and
of course,
many of our neighbors restrict their kids' phone access and phone use, and many, famous CEOs of major companies, internet companies, send their kids to special schools where they don't have computers. And so the things that, they're pushing on the general public are things that they wouldn't even let their own kids use.
Staying on the topic of children, I think one of the other things you mentioned in the book is the way we treat children has possibly changed in the last 20 or 30 years. And so that was actually very interesting. I always find something interesting here where the people that I find interesting, where I read their books, there's usually a crossover with different people, other people that I like. So that the point there that you made in the book was similar to the point of the coddling of the American mind.
Right.
I don't know if that's Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that sparked actually my research last year. I looked into male mental health, because a lot of the points they were making was that the mental health of children is deteriorating, especially amongst young girls, was what they said. But there wasn't so much about male suicide. So that's where males tend to overtake females with taking their own life. So anyway, the question I had, was, do you think we're coddling children, and that's perhaps producing more fragile adults who can't quite cope with the stresses of everyday life, and that might contribute to vulnerability to addiction?
I think we're coddling all of us, right? In this hyper convenient world, we have very little opportunity to experience physical pain. And remember, experiencing physical pain is important for recalibrating our dopamine reward pathway. And if we don't experience it, we're not going to have the opportunity to do that. Beyond even what's painful, many of us don't even exert our physical bodies in any way. In fact, sex may be the last arena in which we have any kind of physical experience, unless we're very into sport or unless we're giving birth, a woman giving birth. But there really aren't a lot of arenas in which people, are in their bodies unless they intentionally seek that out. And that, combined with the incredible overabundance, I think makes us all more vulnerable. And I do think that it's contributed to this skewed parenting, which my generation is essentially, I think, the apex of, or maybe really even the baby boomers who parented the millennials. This idea that, if our kid has any kind of challenging experience, it's going to set them up for being on the psychoanalyst couch, in adulthood. So there has been this tendency to kind of protect our children from anything challenging, to clear the path for them, to facilitate anything they want to do. A terrible kind of parental anxiety about our kid experiencing failure or not having opportunity or being traumatized in some kind of way, which I think really has led, especially among millennials, to a generation of individuals who are not all that emotionally prepared for the real world, because they've not really had the opportunity to build up those mental calluses that allow them to be resilient in the face of failure, suffering, disappointment. And I think that generation is just now kind of realizing that and wondering why they're unhappy and why they're so fragile. Fortunately, we're incredibly adaptive, so I'm very optimistic that the millennials are going to figure it out. And I actually feel really bad for them, because I feel like they've really been sold a bill of goods in terms of what the good life is and how to prepare people, for a meaningful life.
Well, I suppose the ironic thing is, if they're struggling now and maybe they push through it, they'll come out stronger individuals from that.
That's right.
So another thing which is something you've already mentioned, is the pleasure pain balance, which especially with the image of the gremlins, which I found very useful. But one thing I found fascinating about this is I'm seeing similar balances with other aspects of life. And it's this idea of yin yang, masculine, feminine, chaos, order. And it seems that the best way to operate these things is to go right in the middle, or make sure you're keeping the balance going. So a lot of people will take the idea of pain literally, whereas the idea of pain to me would be, which I think you're alluding to in the book, is if you go out for a run, for example, it's not a painful experience, but it is hard. And you will get pleasure afterwards. So it's tipping the balance towards pain to get the pleasure afterwards.
That's right.
So do you think that's useful advice for someone who's struggling with addiction, to almost harness struggle or harness pain to get the pleasure down the road?
Yes. So I advise this to all of my patients, especially in early recovery. First of all, just not using their drug of choice will be painful, as the balance then tips to the side of pain, and the gremlins are sort of camped out there hopping up and down. And of course, if we wait long enough and abstain for long enough, those gremlins hop off and homeostasis, or a level balance, is restored. But one of the things that we can do to speed up that process of withdrawal and restoring homeostasis is actually intentionally do things that are hard. Press intentionally on the pain side of the balance, which is counterintuitive. But when we do that, then those neuroadaptation gremlins actually hop on the pleasure side. And that's things that, as you say, are hard, like going for a run. I also talk about ice cold water baths, but it can be something even more modest than that, like just unplugging, just not listening to music, not watching a show, not being on our computers, sitting in a silent room. That can be really scary and painful. We're suddenly left with our own turbulent thoughts and imaginations and worries and conscience. The things I should have done and didn't do, the ways I've harmed other people. That in itself is really, really hard. But again, really important, because what it does is it builds up those mental calluses. It's basically, we're making dopamine. Whenever I go and ride my bike up this steep hill near my house, I just think I'm making dopamine, because we really are. What happens when we do things that are hard is that there's a gradual, for example, ice cold water baths, there's a gradual increase in dopamine through the duration of the hard thing, like exercise, right, for example, too. And then when we stop that hard thing, those dopamine levels are actually maintained at an elevated level for hours afterwards, which is really amazing. Now, contrast that to using an immediate feel-good substance. What we get is a sudden upward spike of dopamine for a very brief period, followed by a plummeting of dopamine, not just down to baseline levels, but below baseline levels. That's the dopamine deficit state, or the gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance, before it's restored. So there's a huge cost, right? As opposed to this and then that.
One thing you mentioned there, being alone with your own thoughts, something that came to mind is when people are exercising and they're listening to music. I think Andrew Huberman mentioned this in a podcast, actually, saying that you should, the majority of the time, not listen to music or not listen to podcasts when you're exercising, so that you start to get dopamine from the actual activity rather than the music or the podcast. I think Joe Rogan says something as well with exercise, saying that it's actually cheating if you're listening to music and you're doing exercise. I suppose it's the difference between the physical activity. You're still doing the same exercises, but it's the mental exercise you're not doing by listening to music.
Right. I mean, I think what exercise can be and what it's really useful for, in addition to the physiologic, because, exercise is immediately toxic to cells. So what it does is that it causes, our body goes, oh, danger, I need to upregulate my own endogenous production of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, all that good stuff. But the other thing that exercise really can be is a moving meditation where, we allow ourselves to just let our thoughts unfold and ultimately settle down. And that's really what meditation practices do. But sitting meditations are not for everybody. Some people just don't sit well that long or are too physically restless. So those individuals in particular could benefit from a moving meditation where, they let their thoughts just unfold as they will, which is essentially what meditation is, where we're not distracting ourselves from the constant percolation of emotions, ideas, and sensations in the brain. And it's really important to have a period of time in the day when we allow our brains to do that without constantly distracting ourselves. Because essentially, there's this network called the default resting mental network, which is sort of that time when we're not focused on something. So functional imaging studies have shown when we focus on a specific task, certain specific nuclei in our brains light up. But in between those tasks, there's an interesting kind of integration and coordination between disparate parts of the brain called the default mental resting network, which it turns out is really, really important for consolidating memory, for creativity, for rest and renewal of our mental function. And what's happened in the modern world is that many people now don't leave any time for that default mental resting network except when they're sleeping. And many of them have difficulty sleeping, probably because they haven't had any time in the day where they've allowed their brain to rest and reintegrate. Because we're constantly plugged in, we're constantly, even now running, distracting ourselves from ourselves. So I think, sort of thinking about that default mental resting network as a necessary downtime for our brains is really, really important.
I think one consequence of not having that downtime is not being able to know what your mind is like and not being able to view it objectively. Because I think a lot of people, and I think you did mention in the book that you struggled with this, where you have like a horrible thought and then you identify yourself with that thought and think of yourself as such a horrible person for having it. But this is something I went into with a lot of research looking into free will, that I don't believe we have any free will. And so if we're talking about thoughts themselves, if you meditate and observe your thoughts as they arise, you realize you're not making those thoughts, they just appear. So I suppose the one thing we might have some control over, which I'm not convinced we do, is how we identify ourselves with those thoughts. So if we have such a horrible thought, do we say we're a horrible person, or do we say, oh, that was a horrible thought, and move on? That's not us. So what advice would you maybe have for someone who is experiencing that sort of mental anxiety over the thoughts they have?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is if you're someone who, like many of us, who constantly is distracting yourself so that you don't know your own mind and your own percolating thoughts, when you first try to do this exercise, whether it's through a moving meditation or a sitting, resting meditation, you will likely be overwhelmed because the dam will come crashing down, and then all of those thoughts you've been trying to run away from will inundate you. So that's scary and hard. But the longer you allow yourself to just let those thoughts roll down the river, number one, the less it will become, the quieter that river will become as it eventually spreads out, onto the plain. And the key there is just to not, and this is what sort of the definition of mindfulness practices, it's an overused word, but is not to judge yourself for the thoughts, not to, as you say, oh my God, I'm a freak, but instead just be curious, be curious. And you are not your thoughts, right? You can have thoughts without that being something, awful that you're going to do, or that you even want to do. But instead just sort of be curious, like, oh, I wonder what that's about, And over time, again, I think through this default mount, through the integration of the various parts of the brain, it is possible to sort of make sense of those things as long as we're not running away from it.
So the thought that you mentioned in the book is that horrible thought of killing your baby.
Right.
And so but then you came to the conclusion that it wasn't that you wanted to kill your baby. It was that you were so petrified of some harm coming to your child.
Right.
And this is something similar that, so my dad a few days ago had a dream. They've just got a new puppy, and he had a dream of, I think the puppy died in the dream, and he was horrified by it. And that was actually very helpful, because I told him, well, you're not actually thinking you want to kill your puppy. You're actually just really worried that something's going to happen because it's so fragile.
Right. That's right. This vulnerable creature is in your possession, and you're responsible for it. And so the fear of somehow not being able to protect this vulnerable creature is now manifesting as you actively harming the creature. And that's exactly what happened to me as a young mother. But when I could slow myself down and allow myself to actually see the thought, because it was really right outside of conscious awareness, I could have just not seen it, right? And then it would have stayed in the shadows, and I would have continued to have enormous anxiety about being a new mother. But instead, I let it come out, and I was like, oh, that's awful. What does that mean? Does that mean I want to kill my baby? But again, I just let it roll and observe more. And I came to understand, that's not what it means. It means I'm really anxious about harm to this small creature, and I'm feeling the weight of that responsibility. So I think, it's scary to look at those things and sort of accept those kinds of thoughts. But when we can quietly and calmly do that, it can be incredibly empowering, because we can gain confidence in our ability to understand ourselves, to face new challenges, to tolerate distress, instead of constantly just trying to outrun it. Because the outrunning thing just doesn't work. No matter how fast you run, you're never going to run fast enough. It's always going to catch up. Better to just stop, turn around, look at it, and go, okay, this is what I have to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's where the usefulness of looking at things objectively, or using objectivity, comes in, where observing your thoughts is a subjective way to look at it. But perhaps breathing is one thing, where if people just start taking some deep breaths, slowing their heart rate, if they widen their visual field, that's another thing. When you're these are all things that your body automatically does when you have these thoughts or when you're stressed. So doing that, just slowing your heart rate, de-stresses you, so that you can look at things more objectively rather than panicking over them.
That's right. Right. And again, a key is not saying, oh my God, I'm a horrible person, or I'm a freak, or I can't believe I had. And part of why I wanted to share that, I was like, I'm a doctor, right? And I have some crazy thoughts. Doesn't make me a crazy person or a bad person. Like, that's, the brain is sort of like a bubbling cauldron, and just stuff bubbles up, and that's normal, natural. And if we're not consciously aware of it, then sometimes it comes out in our dreams, right? Like your dad's dream, it'll come out in that way. But it's okay to let yourself just be curious about what's going on in your brain, thinking, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Are there any supplements that you recommend to patients for addiction? So the ones that come to mind are like 5-HTP, which does something with serotonin. I'm not sure what it is, but is there anything that you found is useful for addiction?
Well, in general, if I prescribe something, it's usually like an FDA approved drug that has been vetted. I don't know enough about a variety of supplements to feel comfortable saying, this supplement or that supplement, which isn't to say they don't have utility. I just don't know very much about them. But there are FDA approved medicines that can help people with addiction. For example, there's a medicine called naltrexone, which blocks the opioid receptor. And it's helpful not just for people addicted to opioids, but also people addicted to alcohol, because alcohol is mediated in part through our own endogenous opioid system. So when we give people a medicine to block the opioid receptor and they drink alcohol, it just doesn't taste quite as good. So it's a way for that pleasure-pain balance. If alcohol usually tips it a lot and you take naltrexone, it just tips it a little. And then if it just tips it a little, it's not as reinforcing. You don't get as many gremlins on the pain side, and you don't get caught up in that vicious cycle. Naltrexone's also been shown to help people with compulsive gambling. So potentially, again, gambling may be mediated by the endogenous opioid system, naltrexone making it just slightly less reinforcing. And there are other medicines that kind of work in different ways to kind of help people manage this pleasure-pain balance.
Do you have any views on drug policy? Do you think we're doing things correctly now? I think that's perhaps where my interest in this sort of thing came from about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. For my journalism degree, we were tasked with making a short documentary, and I did mine on drug policy, went to a drug charity and filmed there, and then ended up volunteering for that drug charity. I was just very interested in how harmful these drugs can be, and also how beneficial some drugs can be, but ultimately how harmful the drug policies that we have in place now can be. And I think that's maybe sparked interest in free will, because if we don't have any free will, then people who become addicted to drugs didn't make their choices. And that's quite a backwards way that we as a society view people who are addicted to drugs, is they made their own choices. Well, maybe they didn't. Do you think we should be changing our drug policies? Is decriminalization an option, do you think?
Yeah, well, first I just want to echo something you said, which is I very much agree that every mental illness is as a result of the stress vulnerability diathesis. So people come with different degrees of vulnerability, and then it's the environment that determines whether or not they're going to get that mental illness. People who are very vulnerable to that mental illness don't need a very addictogenic environment, and they will get addicted. They'll find something. But with our work ecosystem today, with so many addictive substances and behaviors, even those of us who previously would have been immune to this problem are now vulnerable to the problem of addiction. So I agree with you in the sense that that the environment is a huge player in terms of how many people will get addicted and what they'll get addicted to, and that it's not just about a person's let's say, brain chemistry, because we all have the same wiring that has us approach pleasure and avoid pain. And that's essentially what addiction hijacks, is that motivational circuit. In terms of, the criminal justice system and our drug policies, clearly we haven't figured it out yet. As you well know, in the US, we've had this war on drugs since the 80s, where we arrested people for even possession of small amounts of cannabis, put them in jail, and that as soon as they got out, they continued using. So it didn't decrease the problems of addiction or related harms or criminal activity. And because of structural racism in this country, it led to the vast majority of people who were incarcerated for minor drug possessions being people of color. So clearly, that's not the answer. However, I do not believe that going to the other extreme and making addictive substances legal and widely available is the answer either, because it's very clear that one of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access to that drug. If people have more access through whatever means, they're more likely to get addicted. So I think we need to figure out what that middle road is. I do think that the criminal justice system has a role to play. Why is that? Because one of the common symptoms of severe addiction is that people will engage in illegal activity in order to get their drug of choice. So people with addiction will interface with criminal activity. I conceptualize that as a symptom of their addiction. But it does mean, because they are engaging in unlawful and potentially harmful acts, we do need to hold them accountable. So it's holding them responsible for those actions while also trying to get them treatment for their addiction, which they only have a certain degree of responsibility over. So I guess that's where I come in. I think we have to, and this is happening, in myriad different ways. The criminal justice system partnering with the healthcare system to use things like contingency management or rewards and punishments to funnel people who break the law as a result of their addiction into treatment rather than into pure, incarceration or other legal sanctions.
Now, I don't want to give away the end of the book, but one of the images you use at the end of the book, it reminded me of something I read in another book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Yep, one of my
favorites.
So
in that book, he talks about obviously meaning. But he says that life is like a movie and that it's lots of small images, and you will not figure out the meaning of the movie or of life until you get to the very end. If you skip right to the end of the movie, right to the end of life, you're not going to know what the meaning is. I actually, that small tattoo there, it's a little old style camera.
Yeah.
That's what that was symbolizing.
I love it. That's great.
Yeah. So I think that's something that people can maybe take some sort of hope from, and that when I think that's another thing that's related to addiction as well, is that people are struggling to find meaning. And the answer, which is in that book, the answer is there is no meaning to life. You're not going to find something that's universal like meaning to life. But yeah, do you think that's a similar image to what you were portraying in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it is possible to find meaning, but we don't find it with the grand pronouncements. We find it by living each day according to our values and making meaning, in an iterative way every single day through time, while not knowing exactly where it's going to lead, but trusting in the process. And so I think that's really, one of the key messages that I've learned from my life, but also my patients in recovery, this idea of taking it one day at a time. Because if you stack on a bunch of good days, you get a bunch of good weeks, and good weeks lead to good months, and good months lead to good years. And we can't know exactly where it's all going, but the things that we can control here, in now is, and I guess I do believe I'm curious about your not believing in free will. I'm sure it has to do with like all the antecedents that led up to this particular moment, us not controlling that. But nonetheless, I actually do think that there is that moment of choice that we all have throughout our lived time. And that, as I say in the book, and something one of my very wise patients told me, that one of the things that he learned from recovery from addiction is that the hard way is usually the right way. And I love that, because sometimes when I'm stuck not knowing what to do, or I have a choice and I'm not sure which way to go, I think about that. Well, what's the hard way? What's the path that would be more effortful for me? And I think that that's probably the path I should take. That's probably the right path. So I guess it's those kinds of messages.
Yeah. And talking about your patients, what's the most inspiring patient you've ever had? And
oh my gosh, they're all inspiring. They're all so inspiring, because it takes just tremendous courage to pull yourself out of the hole of severe addiction, and a kind of real faith, frankly, in what the future will bring, and being able to tolerate an enormous amount of psychological and also sometimes physical distress to get there. Just, again, trusting in the process, even when you don't feel good, right? One of the things that I think is a little bit of a, let's say, a misleading stance in mental health treatment today is this idea that, if we know ourselves well enough and we've explored our psyches well enough, then we'll know, what we're supposed to do, or what the thing is that we should be doing now. But the truth is that part of, I think, living a meaningful life is doing something that's actually contrary to what you feel like doing in the moment. And that's really hard. And that's what people in recovery have to do every day for a long time, right? They have to do something contrary to what their brain is telling them to do and asking them to do. And that's, that can be exhausting, right? Day after day after day. But the more they do that, the more they get to that place where, their desires and values are aligned with their true goals, and those things kind of get into sync. But as you're getting there, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, I suppose the one piece of advice would be not to chase happiness, because the more you chase happiness, the more it's going to run away from you. Right. And just accept that you will be happy in some instances and you will be struggling in some instances, but you have at least little control over when you will be happy and when you won't.
Yeah, I think that's really the key, because one of the key features of addiction is that we, at least for a period of time, can control the way we feel in the moment by using our drug, right? I know when I do this thing or ingest this substance, it will change the way I feel right now in a way that I want. And so it's that control that is part of what's so appealing. And recovery is about letting go of that control and acknowledging that we control almost nothing, and that our moments of happiness, the best moments, the ones that are healthiest and have kind of deep meaning for us, we probably won't control at all, right? We can set it up and do this and do that, but at the end of the day, it's going to be, the profoundest moments of happiness sort of come unexpectedly and unbidden, and are brief, very brief. And when they come, we have to just go, oh my gosh, I'm there. It happened, and then that in seconds it will be gone again.
Yeah. So I'm thinking we will have time for some quick fire questions. Quick fire questions. Anyway, so the first part of these questions are from the Tim Ferriss Show. These are not my questions, so I'm not that smart to come up with these amazing questions. So what's one book you've gifted to the most people?
Probably in recent years, a book called Firethorn, which is a part of a historical novel that's 2 books of a trilogy. It's really beautifully written, with a very wonderful female heroine who is sort of the key character. That one I've gifted. It's wonderful. I'm still waiting for the author to write the 3rd book. I have become a bit of a stalker, emailing her, when is the 3rd book coming out? And then I'm blanking on the name of a book on writing that I really love. I can't believe I'm blanking on the name. It'll come to me in a second. Clear and Simple as the Truth.
Okay.
Clear and Simple as the Truth. It's a very good book on writing, but I also think it's a philosophical text. It's covertly a philosophical text about what is knowable and about our ability to find the truth.
Interesting. Okay. What purchase of $100 or less has most impacted your life?
My goodness. Purchase of $100 or less. That's hard. I'm not a person who gets a lot out of buying things. At least I haven't in most of my life. I'm not a shopper. So I don't. Yeah, it's just one of those things that's not my drug of choice, so to speak. So I can't even think of anything.
Okay. What if you could have a gigantic billboard showing to billions of people? What would you want it to say?
I think I would say the right way is usually the hard way, or the hard way is usually the right way.
Very good. I like that. What is one absurd or weird thing that you love?
There are lots of absurd, weird things I love. I love YouTube outtakes of Candid Camera. For some reason, it's hilarious to me to watch people sort of, be in these strange situations, real people in real life, and how they handle it.
Interesting. Okay. In the last 5 years, what belief, behavior, or habit has most impacted your life?
Radical honesty, which I write about in the book, something that I learned from my patients, telling the truth about things large and small, as kind of a daily practice. And I try to do that, and I've gotten much better at it. Still have a ways to go.
Amazing. What advice would you give to a young 18-year-old, and what advice should they ignore?
I guess the advice I would give to a young 18-year-old is get offline, be in the real world, allow yourself to have a sustained thought that's not reactive to somebody else's, but just comes to you from, sitting with your own thoughts, or moving with your own thoughts, but something that's born of you, which I think can only really happen if there are some sustained periods where people are not reacting to things that they get on the internet. And the advice that I would have an 18-year-old ignore, was that the other one?
Yeah.
The one that would have them ignore is look for your passion. I think that we have too much of sort of trying to find that one perfect thing that we were meant to do, when in fact, if we just look around us, at the life we were given, and try to figure out what needs doing, what the work is that needs doing that we can help with, that will lead us to invest our energies in that activity, which will make it interesting and allow it to ultimately become our passion.
I think that's similar to what I would say is that don't close any doors. I think a lot of what we're taught in school is to know what you want to do and then aim single-mindedly at that one thing, no matter what anything else is what else is happening around you. Whereas if you have all your doors open, you might start to realize, well, maybe that's not what I want to do, and start pivoting or start completely U-turn and change direction. And I think that should be encouraged.
Yes, I agree with you. And I love the way that you kind of communicate that. The way that I often say something similar is be open to, the environment. Be open to what the universe is asking you to do. And if you narrow and shut down, then you're not able to see the things that come along, because life is it's just a river. It's flux. And when we're, I think, in our lives the way we were meant to be, we are bobbing along in that river. But if we're just clutching, a log that's sticking out and just determined to hang on to that log, we're not really in the flow of our lives at this time when we were born in humanity. And we're going to miss out on so much.
When you feel overwhelmed or unfocused, what do you do?
I actually pivot to a power outside of myself, and I ask for help.
Wow. Okay. How does that manifest? How do you do that?
I literally feel a kind of physical pivot of my mind to a higher power, and I literally ask for help.
Wow. Do you believe that there is some form of God there, or is it similar to famous Stoics who don't necessarily believe there's a God there, but still believe in asking for something?
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that the Stoics did that. You'll have to tell me where to read more about that. It is I can't answer that simply because I'm still processing what it is for me. And also whenever that word God is invoked, it gets so complicated because it means it's such a rigid concept for some people and so off-putting for others. But I can say for sure, I believe in the pivot, and I believe in the asking, and what exactly the nature is of what the agent being asked. That's a longer discussion.
Sure. These next few questions are from James Lipton from the Actors Studio. These are even quicker than what we just did. So what's your favorite word?
My favorite word? I don't know. And that's not my favorite. It's not that I don't know is my favorite word. I don't know what my favorite word is.
Do you have a least favorite word?
Oh, I wouldn't want to say my least favorite word on the podcast. I do have one. I don't want to say it.
Okay, I'll assume it's a curse word.
No, it's not.
No,
it's a political term. I just don't.
Oh, okay, right,
Yeah,
sure.
Right.
What profession other than your own would you most like to attempt?
Oh, if I could come back as like a singer or an athletic coach, those are two things that appeal to me a lot.
Okay.
Like an actually a talented singer, not a person who can actually sing.
Of course. What profession would you least like to do?
I don't think I would ever be good at anything involving money, unless my life really depended on it. And then I could probably be ruthless, but I wouldn't want to be.
Okay. And this maybe goes back to what we were just discussing. So if heaven exists, what would you like God to say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Oh my goodness. Maybe you were a good mom.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay. And so lastly, just before we finish up, where can people buy the book? And I was listening to you on the Joe Rogan, and I found out it's a New York Times bestseller, and it's sold out a lot of places. So that's amazing. So where can people buy the book? Is it?
Well, it's available in the UK. It's been the rights were bought by Hachette or Headland Publishing in the UK, so it should be available wherever books are sold in the UK, and then also available on Amazon.
Perfect. And you're not on social media, are you?
No, I'm not.
So we won't say that. Good, very good. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to spend your morning and my evening here. It's a massive pleasure, and I do get so much joy when I do, because this is a great thing to do. I read a book and then I get to discuss these things with the authors, and I'm always surprised at how many of you actually take the time. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time.
Well, you're very welcome. It's all, as a writer, it's a great honor that someone takes the time to read what I've written or what someone else has written. So it's always a pleasure to talk with somebody who's done that, taken the time to read a book and then reflect on it. And so it's a joy. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So yeah, enjoy your day. I'll let you get on with starting your day, and I'll finish my day.